Be with you again. Appreciate very much your taking time to join us for our studies in the book of Proverbs. And we are in the 30th chapter of Proverbs currently, and we're looking at this great lesson, the words of Agur. As we began our study, we made the point that not really sure who this Agur is. There's some who have tried to identify him with Solomon, but I don't really think there's any particular evidence to suggest that, though there is some old tradition. But I don't know who exactly this fellow was. He was a wise man. He was the son of Yaka. He had two apparently disciples here that he had addressed wisdom writing to, and by inspiration, this writing was included in the account, in this collection, I should say, of inspired sayings. And the lesson that he taught is a very practical lesson. He began, you remember in verse 2, by saying, "Surely I am more brutish than any man. I have not the understanding of a man, neither have I learned wisdom, nor have the knowledge of the holy." He starts off with a self-depreciating statement of humility, and I think that is the theme that runs through this chapter. The teaching of Agur is the value of humility. He follows that up by pointing out there is a place to find answers, but it's not in men to generate truth. Verse 5 says, "Every word of God is pure, and he is a shield unto them that put their trust in him. Add thou not unto his words, lest he reprove thee, and thou be found a liar." And so with that foundation, he begins to remind us about the value of humility in our daily walk, in our relationship with God. He makes the request of two things that I would ask of you, he says, that you would do for me. "Remove me far from vanity and lies, and give me neither poverty nor riches, lest I be poor and steal and take the name of my God in vain, or lest I be rich and deny thee and say, who is the Lord?" He talks about an evil generation, and he says there is a generation that curses their father and does not bless their mother. There's a generation that are pure in their own eyes, and yet not washed in their filthiness, from their filthiness. There's a generation, how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids lifted up. There is a generation whose teeth are as swords, and their jaw teeth as knives, to devour the poor from off the earth, and the needy from among men. He talks about a generation of people who are totally unaware of their own wickedness. They have no ability, it seems, to reflect, to feel guilt or shame. They are filled with pride. No matter what kind of a wreck their life is, they think themselves to be the great standard. They think they've got the answers, and they're blind to the fact that their life would say the opposite is true. So, this is where we are in the world. We got all kind of folks who are raising their hand, wanting to tell you about how to live and all the answers, and nobody seems to be searching truly their own heart for truth, looking for answers to the questions they've not been able to find, looking up to God. This is what's missing today. Every man is his own God, and every man is right in his own eyes. The nature of greed and the connection between greed and pride. We also looked at verse 15, "The horse leech has two daughters, crying, Give, give. There are three things that are never satisfied, yea, four that say not it's enough." He talks about the insatiable nature of the grave, the barren womb, the earth that's not filled with water, and the fire never says it's enough. The insatiable nature of pride, the inability to recognize enough. Greed and pride go hand in glove together. And we begin tonight in verse 17. As an addendum to that point, we find these words. And let me see if I can negotiate the chart here. In verse 17, the eye that mocketh at his father and despiseth to obey his mother, the ravens of the valley shall pick it out, and the young eagles shall eat it. It's a very grotesque, shocking picture that he draws for us. And the picture that he's looking at, again, relates to the matter of pride. Here's an individual full of the scornful look. Here's the individual who has no respect for their father and for their mother. Where does that come from, by the way? Well, I know it's come from in our society. We've had several generations now who have been trained in the philosophy, I'm talking about parents, in the philosophy that rather than training your children, what you ought to do is just try in every way you can to avoid any conflict. Instead of teaching children to be submissive, to mind, to be able to take their will and submit it to the will of their parents, instead we want to teach children that they're in charge and to do all we can to avoid telling them no. And the result is they don't learn what no means. And so they are little children who don't know what no means, and then they become teenagers that don't know what the word no means. And it doesn't get any better from there. They have no respect for God, no respect for their fellow man. Well, it began because they didn't learn respect for their parents. And so here's a picture of that generation, an eye that mocks at his father and despises to obey his mother. As one fellow put it, that such an individual has just no regard whatever with the will of their parents, of their mother. It means nothing at all to them. They have instead a malicious scorn for those their parents who would try to teach them what to do or would make demands on them. They have a disobedient attitude, and it shows in every way. And what the Lord says here is that kind of generation is headed for ruin. We might broaden that point out and make the point that a society that is given to that kind of behavior, if you have a society that on a large scale will not teach their children respect for authority, there's no way it can survive. It will rip itself apart. Mr. Garrett writes, to shun parental discipline is to embark on a life characterized by a lack of discipline and excessive violence. And such persons are naturally prone to die a violent death. It's a dead-end street, this idea that every individual becomes their own authority. When you destroy the home and the relationships in the home, and we've seen a lot of that, and I think we'll see more of it if we continue to live until it all becomes evaporated. But the idea is that when governments seek to try to undermine the rights of parents, and when we see psychologists and certain school environments that work to try to undermine parental authority, just no way that's going to end well for the child or anybody else. So 3,000 years ago, Solomon would write and make it plain that that kind of prideful spirit that thinks somehow all of the rules that have governed human experience since its beginning don't apply to us. We've just learned better. We've got a better way. No, we really don't. And in the end, we're going to find that out to our destruction. What we must do is to do our best, what we can control, to teach our children a better way. And young people need to have the wisdom to listen, to recognize their own limitations, and to patiently submit themselves so that they might not find the consequences that he's talking about here. Let's look at another passage, if we might, another lesson that Agur teaches along this line. Another list, if you will, a grouping. In this case, there be 3 things which are too wonderful for me, 4 which I know not: the way of an eagle in the air, and the way of a serpent on a rock, and the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a maid. Such is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done no wickedness. The last phrase there, I think, is connected with the former, but is not, I think, in the same tenor, the same moral quality there. He starts out by talking about 4, in this case, marvelous things, 4 wonderful things. Things, he says, that are just too marvelous for me to understand. And in that list, he gives 4 examples. And first is the eagle, a magnificent bird. And, the question becomes, how can an eagle fly? Maybe you're like me. I don't take airplanes that often. But every time I've ever been on one of those big, huge 747 or 777, I think is the biggest I've ever been on, I have the same feeling as we're sitting there on the runway. And I'm looking at the wings, if I'm sitting on the window there, and I look out and I just think, this thing is big as a football field. And there's just no way this will ever get off the ground. But so far it has. And it's amazing. We recently visited down on the Gulf Coast, and where we were staying, the Navy jets from Pensacola do training missions. They fly up and down the coast. And right in front of where we were staying, these F-18s were training, I guess. These are planes that they use to put on air shows and so on. And so this particular grouping out of Pensacola, a couple of these planes came and they after a few minutes began to go through this particular maneuver where they would be flying parallel to the sea, and then the fellow, I guess, would pull the stick back or whatever he's got there, his controls back, and this aircraft would take off with a giant boom, straight up like a moon rocket going up, and it would go that way for some distance, and then it would level off, and it would come back in a loop, and he would pull another lever there that would allow the smoke to come out of the back, and as they do in air shows. And he did that, I don't know, it might have been a half a dozen times, and it was amazing. It was remarkable to see one of these big machines and what they can do, and the speed and the agility and the skill of the pilot to be able to maneuver along that line. And I was really oohing and ahhing about that in my own mind. And then it wasn't too long after that, I saw something even more impressive. I saw a pelican. And that pelican could dive down into the sea and come up with a fish. Not only could he fish, but he could eat the fish and digest it. And that pelican can also breathe and think and reproduce, and as magnificent as that F-18 is, it's just nothing compared, really, with a bird, with an eagle, in its glory and its magnificence. What God has made is really unreproducible by men, though men make marvelous things. There's nothing like nature. And I have to confess, I'm one of these people that I think I don't spend enough time looking at nature. And I spend an awful lot of time with my head over a book in the desk, or I'm busy about this or that task. But there's a value in looking around and seeing what God has made. And that's a great point that we find here from Agur. He said, if you want to learn about wisdom, you need to look at nature. And when you look at an eagle, it just is amazing. It's a marvel how an eagle is able to do what it does. Or as he says, how that a serpent can move on a rock. Doesn't have any feet, doesn't have any hands or even arms or legs. How in the world is it able to negotiate as it does across these flat surfaces where it would be difficult to get traction and so on? Well, it's just a marvel how God made it that way. And actually, it's a master at moving that way. Just like the eagle is a master in how to move through the air. And then I think about the ships. What does he say here? A ship at sea. There's a physics behind how a ship is able to bob up and down in the water. And in these days, even without the mechanisms that we have now, and engines that can propel it through the water, they used sails and so on, or oars. But somehow that ship, even if the wind is contrary, can cut across the sea and can navigate through the waters. I don't know how that happens. I can't explain it. But I know that for a mariner, that's just as natural as breathing. It's a marvel. And yet, in the hands of one who is skilled, a ship is a very exact tool. And then he gives another example when he talks about the way of a man with a maiden. And romantic love is another marvel. And there's a lot of mystery about that as well. And yet, it is a great blessing. And so there are things in the world that are a blessing, though they may seem mysterious from one aspect. They are nevertheless beautiful and God ordained in their place, though they may at times seem mysterious. But then he adds to that this note. After talking about things that are easily mastered in the practice of some, he says here in verse 20, and such is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done no wickedness. She also has become a master of a certain practice, but it's not a pure practice. It's not a godly practice. It's not a God-approved practice. But just as surely as the eagle can negotiate the sky, or the serpent the rock, or the ship the sea, here's an adulteress whose morality is twisted, and yet it's just as natural for her to rebel against God as it is for the eagle to fly. It represents a hardened heart. It represents a pride. We keep coming back to this theme of pride. And here's an individual who is not only twisted and immoral, but proud of it. They have no ability to blush. They have no sense of shame. That's the picture of this woman. Mr. Alden wrote that while a young couple falling in love is a beautiful thing, an unfaithful wife makes a mockery of her vows. Romantic love is a wonder. It's a beautiful thing. You find a couple who are devoted to one another and truly respect the bonds of matrimony and the covenant that husband and wife make. They grow closer together, and their relationship becomes a natural thing. It may start out with two people trying to adjust to each other, but the longer they're at it, the more they truly live up to that expression that we find going back to the very beginning. Two shall become one. Not just physically, but even spiritually. Two shall become one. It's natural. But to the adulteress, sin is natural. It has become nature to her. She wasn't born a sinner, but she certainly has become, it's become her nature by long practice. And she's completely shameless about it. Hebrews 13 comes to mind when we see the contrast here between things that are natural and pleasing to God and sin that has become nature. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Sex is not dirty. It's a creation of God. There's a plan in God's place in God's plan for sexual pleasure, but it's certainly not found in adultery, in betrayal, or in just fornication, two people using each other without the real legal and spiritual commitment to one another. That's ugly and degrading and sinful and condemning, whereas the marriage bed is honorable. But the point is here, to those who are given to sin, it's just as natural as the eagle flying in the sky. Cambridge Bible comments here, the four things of the two preceding verses find their moral in this verse. So lightly does the abandoned woman think of the consequences of her sin, so does it pass away when committed and leave no mark behind. It is but to eat and wipe the lips, and all the trace of the food is gone. She is shameless. We live in a shameless society, by the way. We live in a society that thinks no more of sin than they do of breathing in and out. In in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 13, Paul there is making a point that to believe God and to read His Word is to understand that sin condemns. And that includes sexual sin. The idea that if it feels good, do it is not from God. You know, there are a lot of things that might seem right or be pleasurable in the short term that are wicked, that are, in our case, betrayal, that are just wrong, morally wrong. And Paul, in discussing this, is trying to remind the Christians there at Corinth that the Spirit of God dwells in them as Christians, that their body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And it's unthinkable to take the temple of God, the body, and to make that one with a harlot. But there are some who have no conscience. I think that's the spirit that Paul is describing here in 1 Corinthians 6:13. Meats for the belly, and the belly for meats. Sounds a lot like people today. You know, it's just natural. So you want food, you go get it. You want sexual pleasure, you just go get it. What difference does it make? You know, if it feels good, then that's all the justification needed. But Paul makes the point here that the body is not for fornication. There's a difference between the marriage bed, a lawful marriage, and we have the picture here of fornication, or even worse, I suppose, another layer of sin, adultery. But he's describing here, I think, agorias, the pride that becomes completely unconcerned about right, wrong, about God's law. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done no wickedness. Mr. Bridges put it this way. He said, when shame ceases, the ruin of the victim is accomplished. And surely that's true. We see the fruit of that all around us, I'm afraid. Let's look at another of the Proverbs, the points that Agur made here, the lessons he taught. Look, if you will, in verse 21. For 3 things the earth is disquieted, and for 4 which it cannot bear. for a servant when he reigns, and for a fool when he's filled with meat, for an odious woman when she is married, and a handmaid that is heir to her mistress. He's talked about different groupings, and here he talks about 4 unbearable things, insufferable things, if you will, things that disquiet. That word simply suggests the idea of that which provokes to shaking, troubling, unbearable people, he says here. If you notice this list and think about it, all of these people are people who seem to in some way have formerly suffered, and now they've been lifted up, now they've been blessed, but they don't carry with them a spirit of thanksgiving, but rather it's a spirit of anger and a spirit of bitterness that all comes back to pride. If I have a period through very low and difficult circumstances, and somehow I find myself raised up from that, it is directly related to pride. When I think, now's my chance to make people pay, now I'm going to get back, now I'm going to do as I've been done by. All of that spirit of pride leads to bitterness and misery for other people. So that's the list that he talks about. There are 4 insufferable things, and he mentions those 4. He talks about a reigning servant, a servant who gains authority over others, has neither training nor the disposition to rule well. That's generally true. One fellow put it this way. He said, in the measure of his rule, he shows himself unable to rise above servile habits. Brother Harkrider put it this way. He said, a small man in shoes too big for him is usually intolerable. He's unfit for the position, and so he's tempted to overbearing cruelty to demonstrate that he's an authority. You know exactly. You may not have had to suffer at the hands of such a person, or maybe you have. But we understand exactly what he's talking about here. Through the years in world history, we can find examples. I think it was Caligula. I can't remember. It seems like concerning one of the Roman emperors, it was said that he had the powers of a demigod coupled with the cruelty of a slave. There are people who have faced mistreatment. Certainly Caligula grew up under difficult circumstances, and when he found himself to be emperor, there was just no restraining him. He had no inner restraint, and there was nobody, at least initially, big enough outside. Of course, they did wind up killing him. It all leads to ruin. Stalin's an example of a fellow who grew up in cruelty, and then you give a cruel man power and watch him rise and rule. He's not saying here that people from humble circumstances can never make good leaders or good rulers. We know that's not so. David is a great example of that. One of the great kings in the history of the Bible grew up as a shepherd, but he had the right kind of heart. But he's talking here about that individual who is embittered in their youth and never lets that bitterness go, even after they rise to a position of authority, and especially in those times. We hear about a filled fool. Here's a man who's, by his behavior and his judgment, really, he ought to be without, but somehow he's inherited, somehow he's gained all that he needs and more. A man like that's not going to be wise with what he has. In fact, he'll wind up being a danger to himself and other people as well. And then he mentions here the odious woman. That's the old King James translation, the odious woman. This word, this term, goes back to the idea, of hatefulness or being hated. And that's the question that I think good students have struggled with, is exactly how do we take this expression, an odious woman? Notice here the difference. Adam Clarke, in commenting, paraphrases the expression this way: an ill-tempered woman. The Contemporary English Version translates our passage: a hateful woman who finds a husband. On the other hand, look at the ESV, which reads, an unloved woman when she gets a husband. Do you see the difference in the two? In the first references there, they take this odiousness, this hatefulness, and make it the woman's disposition. This is her spirit. She is a hateful woman who somehow has gotten a husband, and now, she has even a larger platform to be able to be a painful relationship with a number of folks there. And I think that certainly is a danger. If that's the case, it's a passage that would have a special relevance to young people, to young men in this case. If you're thinking about marrying somebody, you might want to find out all you can about their disposition. I thought a wise old fellow one time made a point that was worth remembering. He said, you ought never to marry somebody until you've seen them angry. If you haven't dated them long enough or been with them long enough to have seen them go through trial or circumstance or difficulty, you might want to find out about that kind of thing before you marry than after. That's true about young women as well, in terms of the men that they might have a desire to have a relationship with. Good to get to know folks that way. So 21:9 reminds us it's better to dwell in the house or the corner of a housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. And that's right. So that may be in part what he's talking about, and you can see the connection with pride there, because again, all that big temper comes from a spirit that does not have the proper humility of heart. The reason I struggle with my temper is because I've got too much pride. And it's important for me to come to recognize that. If I'm just a guy that can't control my temper, then really one of the fundamental problems there is I think too much of myself. I wouldn't get angry at other folks so quickly if I realized that my inconvenience is not that big a deal. And if somebody speaks to me in a way that's not very kind, the sooner I learn so what, the better. But if I think myself to be very important, then I have very little tolerance for any kind of mistreatment in any way. Anyway, so maybe the odiousness here has a relationship to her attitude, or maybe as the ESV would indicate, it really goes back to her former circumstance, that she was for a long time hated in the sense that we often find in the Bible of being unloved. Rachel and Leah, that Leah was hated. She, that is, was not really treated with the same kind of affection. And she was sort of an add-on to the picture, and she doubted the true devotion of her husband far after she should have had that reassurance. Maybe in that sense he's talking about a woman who has been deprived of a relationship and of devotion. And somehow down the line she finds a husband, and because she does not have the proper character, now she becomes lifted up, now she becomes filled with a desire to get back at people who may have looked at her in a different way, or whatever it might be. She becomes now hateful because she was hated. I think probably both these ideas meet at some point. But an odious woman, related again to pride, can be a very unpleasant experience. And then, similar point, a handmaid who becomes an heiress. We think about Hagar in relationship to Sarah and the conflict that was caused there. Adam Clark writes, a servant maid, when either through the death of her mistress or the sin of the husband, she is in fact exalted to be head over the family, is so insolent and impudent as to be hateful to everyone and execrated by all. The old principle of success going to somebody's head, related to pride. It's an insufferable thing, the wise man would say. Think about the contrast between this spirit and Proverbs 19 and verse 10 we looked at not too long ago. It is not fitting for a fool to live in luxury, much less a slave to rule over princes. Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. A wise person can handle that kind of promotion, but a fool, a proud fool in this case, will allow it to go to his head and he'll make a mess of things. Wisdom and humility call us away from that smallness of spirit that desires to get people back and show them where I am and make sure they know that I'm somebody now. It calls us to patience. Humility and wisdom call us to a turning away from wrath and a turning to a different kind of spirit entirely. Okay, let's look at one more grouping, if we might. This time in the 24th chapter of, 24th verse of Proverbs 30. There are four things which are little upon the earth, but they are exceeding wise. The ants are a people not strong, and yet they prepare their meat in summer. The conies are but a feeble folk, yet they live in houses, yet they make their houses in the rocks. The locusts have no king, and yet they go forth all of them by bands. And the spider takes hold with her hands, and is in kings' palaces. We have seen four odious and hateful things and wonderful things. Here we see another grouping, four things that are weak and yet strong. They're small and yet wise. And he pictures for us four very memorable examples. In the first place, he talks here about the ants. I'm sorry. Let me see if I can get this right now. There we go. You know, my generation and certainly the ones before me, I'm not sure how common this is now. I can remember when a toy for a kid might be an ant farm. They sell ant farms anymore. You'd want to put ants in some sort of a little container where you could watch them and to learn from them. Unless it's a video game, I'm sure we don't have much of that now. But anyway, you know, ants are fascinating to look at. And to see how those creatures, you could crush, I don't know, scores of them under just one shoe if you wanted to. If they're fire ants, we're probably not going to get close enough to look at them except maybe to try to get rid of them. But when you see an ant colony and you see how they are able to work toward a goal, in this case he pictures for us the idea of ants who have the wisdom to prepare. They have a God-given instinct that in human beings we would see as foresight, to be able to work today for the betterment of sometime down the future, and even for those of the next generation, if you will. Just remarkable, the wisdom that God placed in an ant. The ant's not very strong. You could crush an ant between your fingers easily. You might step on them and not even know. And yet you can look at an ant and you can learn something. You know, early on in the Proverbs we had seen, again, ants pointed to as being the teachers of wisdom. I'm turning back to the 6th chapter of Proverbs. And I think it's in verse 6. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. He calls on lazy people to just look at an ant. Consider her ways and be wise. How that in verse 8 she provides her meat in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. And yet there are some people who will not work and who don't think about tomorrow. So here's the picture of an ant being, in that sense, provident by the instinct that God has given. He talks about the conies. The old King James uses that term. Maybe your translation uses a term like the rock badgers. These little creatures, they have several different cousins, different species, I guess, that of similar nature. But maybe you've watched some of these nature shows, and you'll see little critters like this, and they live in colonies. And when they feed, they might be out foraging, but they'll always have one of their number who will be up on the rock somewhere on their back legs looking around. One of their most fearsome enemies, if you will, adversaries, is the eagle, who can come in at great speed, and just carry them off. And so they always have somebody watching. They know they're no match for an eagle. And so all they can do is just watch, try to look for the danger, and before it gets to them, to run. Where they go and where they live are in rocks. They find a refuge. They find a strong place in order to be able to compensate for their weakness. And I think it's a great lesson there. Great, simple, but a great point to make. I'm thinking back on that passage in the Psalms, in the 61st Psalm, I think it is, where David once wrote these words, "Hear my cry, O God, and attend to my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For thou hast been a shelter for me, and a strong tower from the enemy." We've made a song out of that. We sometimes sing that old song, "Let me fly to the rock that is higher than I." It's based on the sentiment of this passage, this statement that David wrote. And what it recognizes is the fact that we need refuge. We're not strong enough. We're not big enough to handle this on our own. And what Solomon does is he points us back to these little creatures. And they're not strong. They're feeble. But I'll tell you what they do know. They know that life is dangerous. And they know that they need help. And they know how to go to the rock to find refuge. Now, I think there are a lot of good lessons there, physically and spiritually. Our young people need to learn. And it's one of the things we try to teach them as parents. It's a dangerous world. That's true physically. As our young people grow up and as they begin driving, and their parents say, "I don't want you going here, I don't want you going there." What the young people need to remember is it's not because the parents don't have confidence in them. They have great confidence in them in all these cases. It's rather that they don't trust the dangerous world around them. And that's what's got them concerned. And I tell you, that's true spiritually. This world is not again, another song, not a friend to grace to lead us on to God, as the old song said. It's sure not. It's a dangerous place. It's filled with wolves. It's filled with temptation. It's the enemy's territory. We need to learn from these conies how to stay close to the rock. And that's a piece of wisdom that'll help us whether we're young or old. Okay, we'll have another couple of things to say about this passage, and then we'll move on and may get to the 31st chapter, Lord willing, next week. But we'll pause for now. Thanks so much for listening. Appreciate so much your interest in